It was a long stretch of road, nothing but the thick silhouette of trees pressing in on both sides, swallowing the last light of day. My car hummed steadily beneath me, tires gliding over the damp pavement. I was on my way home from a weekend trip with friends, the trunk packed with forgotten beer bottles and the scent of bonfire clinging to my clothes. The road was familiar, yet unsettling at this hour. It was one of those routes that felt endless, where the occasional roadside sign or abandoned gas station only emphasized the loneliness rather than broke it. I tried to keep my mind occupied, humming along to static-filled radio, but the silence outside was pressing. Then, up ahead, I saw her. A woman stood just off the shoulder, her thin frame barely visible in the dim headlights. Her posture was rigid, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding against the cold. As I neared, I instinctively slowed, the inner battle between caution and sympathy already warring in my chest. She looked fragile, her skin pale, hair clinging wetly to her face. I rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, do you need help?" Her face lifted, and for a moment, I hesitated. Her eyes were sunken, darkened in a way that made her expression unreadable, but her lips parted into a small, grateful smile. "My car broke down just a mile back," she said, her voice hoarse. "I just need a ride to the nearest town." I hesitated. Picking up strangers was never something I did, but she looked exhausted, stranded. It would be cruel to leave her here. "All right," I murmured, unlocking the door. "Hop in." She slid in without another word, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the car. The scent of damp earth clung to her, an unnatural cold radiating from her skin. The silence stretched. "You live around here?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. She didn't answer at first. When I glanced at her, she was staring at me, unblinking. "My home's not far," she finally said. I nodded, uneasy. "All right, I'll take you there." The drive continued, each mile growing heavier. Something about her presence felt wrong. And then, I noticed it. Her hands. They were covered in something dark, something thick, dried blood. I gripped the wheel, my pulse hammering. My mouth felt dry, words caught in my throat. I should have turned around. I should have thrown her out of my car. But when I looked over, she was smiling again. And it wasn't grateful this time. It was knowing. I didn't ask questions. I just drove. The road seemed to stretch endlessly now, twisting into unfamiliar turns. My knuckles were white against the wheel, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not until she told me to. And then she did. "Turn here," she whispered. It wasn't a road. It was a narrow, overgrown path leading into the forest. My breath hitched. "I don't think." "Turn," she repeated. I didn't. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator. Then, suddenly, her hand gripped my wrist. Hard. The car swerved violently, my vision blurring as I fought for control. A scream rose in my throat but died when I looked at her. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was staring, her darkened eyes wide, her lips moving soundlessly, forming words I couldn't understand. And then, she was gone. Vanished. The car was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. My breath came in short gasps, my fingers trembling as I reached for my phone. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror. A shape. Standing in the road. Watching me. The woman. And this time, she wasn't alone. They were standing there. A dozen figures. Still. Waiting. I didn't stay to find out why. I floored the gas, tearing down the road, my pulse a violent drum in my ears. I didn't stop driving until I saw the lights of a town. Until the world felt normal again. But even now, in the dead of night, when the roads are empty and the silence presses in, I still see them. Standing in the distance. Watching. Waiting. Story 2. I don't pick up hitchhikers. Ever. It's something I've always sworn against. My father was a truck driver, and he drilled it into me growing up. You don't pick up people on the side of the road. You don't know who they are, and you don't want to find out. But that night, I broke my own rule. It was a long drive, 5 hours straight, heading home after visiting my mother in the hospital. The road stretched through miles of empty countryside, a barren landscape of fields and abandoned farmhouses. My only company was the dim glow of my dashboard and the occasional flicker of headlights in the rearview mirror. Then I saw him. A man, standing at the edge of the road, his thumb outstretched. His clothes were tattered, hanging off his frame like they'd been soaked and dried 100 times. He looked desperate, hollow-eyed and shaking. I should have kept driving, but something in me hesitated. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the way he just stood there, head slightly bowed, like he'd been waiting for me specifically. I slowed the car, rolling down my window just an inch. "You need a ride?" He stepped closer, his face momentarily illuminated by my headlights. His skin was sallow, his lips cracked and dry. "Yes," he croaked. "Thank you." I hesitated, but finally unlocked the door. He climbed in without another word, sinking into the passenger seat with a heavy sigh. For the first few miles, we didn't speak. The air inside the car felt different, heavier. He sat rigid, hands clasped in his lap. Every so often, I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't fidget, didn't look around, just sat there. I cleared my throat. "So, where you heading?" He turned his head slowly, eyes locking onto mine. "Home." I swallowed. "Where's home?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The road felt darker now, the trees outside taller, leaning inward like they were closing in. Then, out of nowhere, he whispered, "It's close." My fingers tightened on the wheel. Something about his voice sent a cold prickle down my spine. I forced a chuckle. "That's so?" "Yes," he murmured. "You're taking me there." My stomach twisted. The way he said it, it wasn't a request. I laughed uneasily. "Yeah, well, I think I should know where we're going first, man." He didn't blink. "Keep driving." That's when I noticed his hands. They were shaking, not in a nervous way, but violently, like something inside him was trying to escape. His fingers twitched, curling inwards, nails scraping against his palms. His breath had become shallow, ragged. Then, ever so softly, he whispered, "It's been so long." My skin crawled. I tried to stay calm. "Hey, buddy, are you all right? You sick or something?" His head twitched slightly. "No," he muttered. "Not sick. Just hungry." The word hungry sent an ice-cold knife through my gut. I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, engine roaring. The man didn't react, didn't even flinch. He just stared at me, an eerie smile creeping across his face. And then, he started laughing. A low, guttural sound, bubbling up from his throat like he was choking on it. His whole body convulsed with it, his shoulders shaking, his hands trembling harder. Then he whispered, "You should have kept driving." And he lunged at me. I swerved violently, the car skidding off the road. His hands clawed at my throat, fingers digging into my skin. The laughter had turned into a ragged, hungry growl. I fought back, elbowing him in the ribs, trying to keep control of the wheel. The car spun, tires screeching against the dirt. Then suddenly, he was gone. Just gone. The passenger seat was empty. I gasped for air, heart pounding as I frantically scanned the road, the fields, the darkness beyond. Nothing. The car was still, silent, but the seatbelt was unbuckled, and the door was locked. I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, to breathe. Then, slowly, I pulled back onto the road, hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't stop again. I drove straight home, locked my doors, and sat in my car until the sun rose. When I finally found the courage to get out, I noticed something. Something scratched into the dashboard. For words. "You took me home. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. And I never will again." Story 3. I've always hated driving at night. Something about the way the world turns hollow, the way headlights carve out tunnels in the dark, the way the road seems to stretch forever without any end in sight. It makes me feel like I'm the only person left alive. That's why I usually take the highway. I like knowing that there are still people out there, even if we're all just passing through. But this time, I made a mistake. I took the back roads. It was supposed to be a shortcut, cutting through the old wooded highway that barely anyone used anymore. I'd driven it before during the day, and while it was a little eerie, it was nothing special. Just miles of trees, no houses, no gas stations. But at night, it was different. The road was black as ink, swallowed by the towering pines. My headlights felt useless, barely pushing back against the darkness. My GPS flickered in and out, struggling to find signal. It was just me, the road, and the sound of my tires rolling over the cracked pavement. Then, up ahead, I saw him. A man was standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes hard, my heart slamming against my ribs as my car skidded to a stop just a few feet from him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring. I hesitated, gripping the wheel. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes that looked damp and heavy, like he'd been out here for hours. His face was obscured in the shadows, but I could see his hands, hanging limply at his sides, fingers twitching slightly. I rolled my window down an inch. "You okay, man?" "Nothing. Just silence." I felt a cold prickle creep up my spine. I should have just hit the gas. I should have driven right past him. But instead, I unlocked the door. He got in. The second he sat down, the air in the car changed. It got colder, thicker. I could feel it pressing against my skin, crawling into my lungs. My breath came out shaky, visible in the dim light of the dashboard. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His head turned toward me, slow and deliberate. "Just drive," he murmured. I gritted my teeth. "Listen, man, I need to know where." "Drive." The way he said it, like a whisper made of ice, it made my stomach clench. I swallowed hard and did as he said. The silence stretched between us. The longer I drove, the worse it got. I could feel him watching me, his gaze heavy, crawling over my skin like something tangible. I kept my eyes locked on the road, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. His hands. They weren't just twitching anymore. They were moving. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers curled, flexed, like he was gripping something invisible. His nails scraped against the fabric of his pants, over and over. And then, he started whispering. At first, it was too soft to understand. Just a low murmur, a dry rasping sound beneath his breath. But then I heard it. "Do you see them?" I clenched my jaw, my pulse hammering. "See what?" He didn't answer. He just lifted one hand, bony fingers outstretched, and pointed to the rearview mirror. I didn't want to look. I really didn't want to look. But some horrible, irresistible force made me. And that's when I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing just beyond the glow of my taillights, barely visible in the darkness. They were watching. Their faces were pale, their bodies still. Then, slowly, they started walking. I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. The man beside me didn't react. He just kept staring ahead, his expression unreadable. "They don't like when people leave," he whispered. I ignored him. I didn't care what he was talking about. I just needed to get out of there. The trees blurred past, the road twisting and turning beneath my tires. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, my hands locked around the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. And then, the car went dead. Everything. The headlights, the engine, the dashboard, gone. The world plunged into darkness. I gasped, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black. No power, no signal. The air was suffocating now, thick and heavy like something pressing down on my chest. Then, the man spoke. "They're here." I turned, my heart clawing its way up my throat. But the seat was empty. He was gone. I spun around, frantically scanning the darkness. My hands fumbled for the door handle, ready to bolt, ready to run. But then, a hand slammed against the window. Pale, lifeless. Another, and another. They were everywhere. Their faces pressed against the glass, hollow eyes staring in. Their mouths moved soundlessly. Then, one by one, the doors unlocked. Click, click, click. My breath hitched. I reached for the lock, my fingers trembling. And then, everything came back. The lights, the engine, the figures were gone. The road was empty. I didn't question it. I floored the gas and didn't stop until I saw the neon glow of a gas station. I stumbled out of the car, my knees shaking, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at my reflection in the car window. But when I finally looked away, my stomach dropped. Because there, scratched into the paint of my car, were 4 words. "You brought them home." Story 4. The storm had rolled in fast. 1 minute, the sky was clear, pale blue stretching endlessly above the empty Tulane highway. And the next, it was swallowed by thick, rolling clouds. The rain came suddenly, hammering against the roof of my car, making my wipers struggle to keep up. I was still 3 hours from home, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but trees and old, forgotten farmhouses dotting the endless stretch of road. That's when I saw the woman. She was standing just off the shoulder, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Her clothes were soaked through, hair clinging to her face, arms wrapped tightly around herself. I hesitated. I don't pick up hitchhikers. I never have. But something about the way she stood there, alone, shivering, made my stomach twist. I slowed the car, rolling down the window just enough to be heard over the storm. "Hey, do you need help?" She lifted her head, eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, she just stared. Then, slowly, she nodded. "My car broke down," she murmured. Her voice was soft, almost drowned out by the rain. I just need a ride into town. There was no town nearby, not for miles. But against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. She slid into the passenger seat without another word. The air inside the car felt instantly colder. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. "Where were you headed?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay light. She hesitated. "Home." That answer again. I nodded, pretending that didn't unsettle me. "Well, I can take you to the next gas station at least. Maybe you can call someone." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned her head slowly to look at me. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "You're a kind man," she murmured. I forced a chuckle. "I just don't like leaving people stranded in this kind of weather." She smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was wrong, too wide, too knowing. Then, softly, she whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." A chill ran through me. I swallowed hard. "What?" She didn't answer. The rain slammed harder against the windshield. The road seemed darker now, like the trees were closing in, stretching taller, looming closer. My knuckles were white against the wheel. And then, the radio crackled. The static filled the car, sharp and grating. I reached to turn it off. "No," she whispered. I froze. Her voice had changed. Deeper. Wrong. The radio crackled again. And then, beneath the static, a voice. "He's bringing her back." My breath caught. I turned to look at her, but the passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screaming against the wet road. My heart was a hammer in my chest. She was gone. Vanished. I was alone. I gasped for air, my mind racing. I turned, searching the dark road, the trees. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror. A shape. Standing in the middle of the road. Watching. I didn't stay to find out why. I hit the gas, speeding into the storm, refusing to look back. It took me hours to calm down. But when I finally got home, pulling into my driveway, something in my gut twisted. Because there, sitting in my passenger seat, was a soaking wet jacket. Not mine. Not mine at all. And stitched into the collar. A name. My name. Story 5. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wilderness. It was past midnight, and the road was empty, save for the occasional sign warning of sharp turns ahead. The headlights of my old sedan barely pushed back against the darkness, illuminating only a few feet at a time before the night swallowed it whole. I was heading home after visiting my sister in another state, a 6-hour drive through the middle of nowhere. It had been a long, exhausting day, and fatigue was creeping up on me. My eyelids felt heavy, my mind foggy. I cranked up the radio, hoping the music would keep me awake. That's when I saw him. A man stood just off the shoulder, his back to the road, his head slightly bowed. His clothes were dark, tattered, blending almost seamlessly with the night. He wasn't holding out a thumb, wasn't signaling for help. He just stood there, unmoving, like a statue. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. I should have kept driving, but my foot hesitated over the gas. Something about the way he stood there, alone in the middle of nowhere, unsettled me. What if he was hurt? What if he needed help? Against every instinct screaming at me, I slowed down. As my headlights swept over him, the man moved. Not much, just the slightest tilt of his head, like he had heard something. Like he had heard me. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to push down my fear. I rolled the window down just an inch. "Hey man, you all right?" He turned. My breath caught in my throat. His face was wrong. Too long. Too pale. His features stretched just a little too much, like someone had pulled at the skin but hadn't quite gotten it right. His eyes were sunken, black pits that reflected the light of my car in a way that made my stomach twist. He smiled. A slow, deliberate curl of the lips. I gripped the wheel tighter. Something about him, about it, made every part of me scream to get away. But before I could hit the gas, he moved. 1 second, he was beside the road. The next, he was standing right at my window. I barely had time to register the motion. He hadn't walked, hadn't run, hadn't jumped. He had just appeared. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Need a ride?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. His smile widened. "Yes." His voice was a whisper, a dry rasp that barely sounded human. I didn't want to let him in, but my hand moved to the lock anyway. Click. The door swung open, and he slid inside. The air in the car dropped instantly, cold enough that I could see my breath fogging the windshield. The scent of damp earth and something rotten filled my nose. He didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there, staring straight ahead. I forced my shaking hands to grip the wheel. Where you headed? Silence. The road stretched ahead, empty and unchanging. My fingers ached from how tightly I was clenching the wheel, my foot pressed hard against the gas pedal. He still wasn't answering. I risked a glance at him. His head was tilted now, ever so slightly, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, softly, he whispered, "You hear it too, don't you?" The hair on my arm stood on end. I swallowed. "Hear what?" He turned to me then. His face was closer than it had been before. Too close. "The voices," he whispered. "They've been waiting for you." Something slammed against the back of my car. I yelped, swerving violently. The tires screeched, the car fishtailing before I managed to right it. My heart was hammering, sweat slicking my palms. I whipped around, scanning the back seat. Nothing. The car was empty. Just me and him. I turned back, gasping for breath. He was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The door was still locked. But the smell remained, that thick, cloying stench of rot. I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the highway as fast as my car could take me. I didn't stop, didn't breathe, didn't look back. I only made it home as the sun began to rise, shaking so badly I could barely get the key into my door. But when I opened it, stepping inside my apartment, my blood ran cold. Because there, sitting neatly on my kitchen table, was a single item, a dark, tattered jacket, and stitched into the collar, my name.